Welcome to the very first episode of the Blackmere podcast. I'm really glad you're here. This podcast exists for one reason: to deepen and enhance your experience with the stories I create. If you've been reading my work on Substack or following along with the worlds I build, this is where we go a layer deeper into the history, the atmosphere, and the darker questions that inspired the fiction in the first place. It's actually perfect timing to begin this journey together, because I've just recently launched my debut medieval horror novella, A Procession of Ashes, a story born from the collision of history, faith, fear, and the terrifying uncertainty of a world that feels like it's coming apart. A Procession of Ashes is currently available for purchase on Amazon. It is offered in ebook format, paperback, and is also available on Kindle Unlimited. Today, we're going to step beyond the page for a moment and dive into the real history and lore that the novella draws from. The lived reality of Plague-era Europe, the collapse of spiritual certainty, and the strange movements that rose when people could no longer find comfort in the institutions they once trusted. This first episode is called The Year the World Ended, 1349. And before we begin, I want to invite you to listen to this, not just as a history lesson, but as an experience. Imagine the streets, the bells, the silence where laughter used to be. Because once we enter this world, it's difficult to forget. Let's begin. The year is 1349. The place is Piacenza, a city in northern Italy, sitting at the crossroads of the ancient Roman road, the Via Emilia, and the wide brown waters of the Po River. It is a city that has, for centuries, been a place of commerce and faith, of market days and feast days, of the ordinary, unhurried rhythms of medieval life. But that life is over. A thin, cold rain is falling through the late September air. It mingles with the smoke of pyres that never seem to go out, and with another smell, one that no amount of incense or burning rosemary can mask. It is the copper-sweet stench of blood and the sour, cloying bite of decay. It rises from the plague pits dug into the courtyards of churches, from the bodies that lie waiting in doorways, from the very stones of the city itself. This is the scent of the Black Death, and in Piacenza, in the autumn of 1349, it is everywhere. Every morning begins not with birdsong, but with the tolling of bells. Not the bright, celebratory pealing of feast days, but a ragged, metallic counting of the dead. 37 yesterday, 40 today. And before the echo even fades across the rooftops, another name is pressed into the palm of a priest, a child, a mother, a father. A gap-toothed girl named Lucia, 7 years old, her chest shallow as a guttered lamp. The living are becoming a minority. This is a world where faith has begun to curdle into fear, where the prayers of the righteous go unanswered, and the institutions that once held society together are crumbling into dust. The church, once a mighty fortress, has become a house of ghosts, its priests either dead or fled, its rituals empty gestures in the face of a relentless, invisible enemy. And into this void, something new is stirring, a different kind of faith. A faith born of desperation and pain. A faith that finds its voice not in prayer, but in the crack of the whip and the shedding of blood. A procession of men, stripped to the waist, their backs a living map of scars and wheels, marches through the muddy streets. They are the brotherhood of broken flesh, the flagellants, and they have come to Piacenza to offer a new gospel. One written not in ink, but in blood and bone. Each week, we're going to step into the historical world behind this story. not just to understand the facts, but to feel them, to understand not just what happened, but what it was like, what it smelled like, what it sounded like, what it did to the people who lived through it. In this first episode, The Year the World Ended, we're going to explore the reality of Piacenza in 1349. We'll look at the Black Death not as a chapter in a history book, but as a lived catastrophe, a disaster so immense, so indiscriminate, so theologically destabilizing that it shook the foundations of an entire civilization. We'll explore the collapse of the church's authority, the psychological devastation of mass death, and the desperate, sometimes terrifying, spiritual responses that emerged in the plague's wake. And we'll do all of this through the eyes of a man standing at the center of the storm, Father Matteo, a parish priest in Piacenza, a man who has shepherded a dying flock through plague and lime, and who is finding with each passing day that his faith is hollowing out from within. This isn't just a story about a plague. It's a story about what happens when the systems we trust, our governments, our religious institutions, even the bonds of family, fall apart. It's about the vacuum of power that's created, and the new, often terrifying, ideologies that rush in to fill it. It's a story about the eternal human need for meaning in the face of chaos. And it's a story that, in ways that might surprise you, is as relevant today as it was nearly 700 years ago. To truly understand what happened in 1349, we have to go beyond the abstract idea of a plague. We have to walk the streets of Piacenza, and we can, thanks to the words of a man who was there. His name was Gabriele de Mussi. He was not a historian or a poet. He was a notary, a lawyer, a man of facts and records, a man trained to observe and document. He was a citizen of Piacenza, and he survived the Black Death. And in a chronicle he called the Historia de Morbo, the history of the sickness. He left us one of the most chilling eyewitness accounts of the plague ever written. De Mussi's account begins not in Piacenza, but in the distant Black Sea port of Caffa, in what is now Crimea. He describes how the plague arrived in Europe in the late 1340s, carried by Genoese trading ships from the east, their holds full of goods, and, invisibly, of death. The ships that docked at Messina in Sicily in the autumn of 1347 were already ships of the dead, their crews dying or already gone, their bodies covered in the black, swollen lumps that gave the disease one of its names. The port authorities drove the ships away, but it was already too late. The plague had come ashore. From Sicily, it moved north and west with terrifying speed, following the trade routes, the river valleys, the roads. By the spring of 1348, it had reached the great cities of northern Italy, Genoa, Venice, Florence, and, inevitably, Piacenza. The city was perfectly positioned to receive it. It sat at a crossroads, a place where merchants and travelers from all directions converged. The same geography that made it prosperous, made it vulnerable. Before the plague, Piacenza was a city of perhaps 20 to 30,000 people, a substantial city by medieval standards. Its market days were lively, its churches full, its streets busy with the commerce of the Po Valley. The city had a cathedral, the Duomo, and a network of parish churches, each with its own priest, its own community of the faithful. It was, in the language of the time, a city under God's protection. By 1349, that protection had manifestly, catastrophically, failed. Imagine walking through Piacenza in the autumn of that year. The first thing that would strike you is the smell. Not just the ordinary smells of a medieval city, the livestock, the tanneries, the open drains, but something else entirely. something that gets into your clothes and your hair and stays with you. It is the smell of decomposition, of bodies in various stages of decay, but it is mixed with something sharper, more chemical, the acrid bite of quicklime. Lime buckets lined the walls of churches and public buildings. They were one of the few tools available for managing the sheer volume of the dead. Quicklime, calcium oxide, was shoveled into mass graves, thrown over bodies in the streets, its caustic white dust filling the air, burning the eyes and throats of anyone who came near. It was not a solution. It was a gesture of desperation, a way of trying to impose some order on a situation that had long since spiraled beyond any human capacity for control. The sounds of the city had changed too. The laughter of children, the chatter of the marketplace, the songs drifting from the taverns, all gone, replaced by a heavy, watchful quiet. You would hear the scrape of the death carts on the cobblestones, the low murmurs of the Beccamorti, the gravediggers, men who had taken on the most dangerous and most despised work in the city. Often they were convicts, offered their freedom in exchange for service. Or they were the desperately poor, with nothing left to lose. They moved through the streets with cloths soaked in vinegar pressed to their faces, hauling bodies from homes, stacking them on carts, taking them to the pits. And the sights. Bodies left in doorways, their faces covered by a simple cloth, if they were lucky. Houses marked with a red cross, their doors and windows shuttered, the families inside either dead or dying. The plague pits themselves, often dug in the courtyards of churches or just outside the city walls, where bodies were laid in layers, separated by earth and lime, stacked sometimes dozens deep. One chronicler compared it to lasagna. Another described the bodies as being stacked like cordwood. These were not metaphors born of callousness. They were the only language available for describing something that had no precedent. The plague itself, what we now know as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was a death of extraordinary violence and speed. It began with a fever, a headache, a sudden and overwhelming exhaustion. Then came the buboes, swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpit, the neck, swellings that could grow to the size of an apple, hard and agonizing, that turned black as the disease progressed. In some cases, the infection spread to the lungs, becoming pneumonic plague, which could be transmitted through the air and killed even faster. In others, it entered the bloodstream directly, causing septicemic plague, which turned the skin black with hemorrhages and killed within hours. The medieval physicians who tried to treat it were largely helpless. Their understanding of disease was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the idea that illness was caused by an imbalance among them. They prescribed bloodletting, purging, and aromatic herbs to counter the miasma, the bad air, that they believed carried the disease. Some recommended fleeing the city. Others prescribed a diet of figs and onions. None of it worked. The plague moved through the city's population with a terrible, indifferent efficiency. De Mussi wrote that in Piacenza, the plague devastated entire religious communities. In one religious house alone, over 50 priests died. The mortality rate for clergy across northern Italy was staggering. In some areas, more than half of all priests died within a year. And this was not just a tragedy for the church as an institution. It was a catastrophe for the people who depended on those priests for the most fundamental rituals of their lives and deaths. To understand what the loss of those priests meant, you have to understand the role of the church in medieval life. This is not the church as a distant, bureaucratic institution. This is the church as the very fabric of daily existence. It was the church that baptized you at birth and gave you your name. It was the church that married you, that buried your parents, that heard your confessions, and offered you the assurance that your sins were forgiven. It was the church that explained the world to you. Why the seasons changed, why the crops failed, why you suffered, why you died. It offered a narrative for everything. And at the center of that narrative was a promise that if you lived rightly, if you confessed your sins and received the sacraments, you would be saved. Death was not the end. It was a passage. And the priest was the gatekeeper of that passage. He administered the last rites, the viaticum, the final sacrament that prepared the soul for its journey. Without it, the medieval Christian faced not just death, but the terrifying prospect of dying unshriven, their sins unabsolved, their soul in peril. Now, imagine that priest is dead, or has fled, or is himself too sick to come to your bedside. Imagine dying in a city where the churches are overwhelmed, where the confessionals stand empty, where the priest who comes to administer the last rites is himself trembling with fever, his hands barely steady enough to make the sign of the cross. Or imagine that no one comes at all. This was the reality for thousands of people in Piacenza and across northern Italy in 1348 and 1349. And the psychological and spiritual consequences were devastating. The church's official explanation for the plague was that it was a divine punishment, God's wrath visited upon a sinful humanity. This was the standard theological response to catastrophe, and it had a certain grim logic to it. But the Black Death strained that logic to the breaking point, because the plague did not punish the sinful and spare the righteous. It killed everyone. It killed children who had barely had time to sin. It killed priests and monks who had devoted their lives to God. It killed the pious and the devout with the same indiscriminate fury it visited upon the wicked. People began to ask the questions that no institution, no theology, no authority could answer. Why is God doing this? What have we done to deserve this? If prayer cannot stop it, what can? If the priests are dying alongside the sinners, what does that say about the power of the church? What does it say about the power of God? These were not idle philosophical questions. They were the desperate, terrified questions of people watching their children die, watching their neighbors die, watching their world dissolve around them. And when the church could not answer them, when the official theology rang hollow against the sheer, overwhelming evidence of God's apparent indifference, the crisis of faith that followed was profound and lasting. Boccaccio, writing in Florence just a year after the worst of the plague, described a city in which the social fabric had completely unraveled. Such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity, he wrote, that brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and oftentimes wife her husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, as if they had been strangers. This was not the behavior of a society held together by faith and duty. This was the behavior of a society in freefall. Father Matteo stands at the center of this collapse in a procession of ashes. He is not a historical figure, but he is a deeply historical one, a composite of the thousands of real priests who faced this impossible situation in the cities and towns of northern Italy. He is a man who has done his duty. He has not fled. He has not locked himself in his rectory and waited for the plague to pass. He has gone to the bedsides of the dying. He has whispered the last rites over the cooling bodies of children. He has pressed his fingers to the foreheads of the delirious and the terrified and made the sign of the cross. He has shepherded his flock through plague and lime, as the novel says, and it has cost him something he cannot name. His faith is not lost in a single, dramatic moment of crisis. It is eroding, quietly and relentlessly, death by death. The rituals that once gave him comfort, the Latin prayers, the familiar gestures of the Mass, the weight of the rosary in his hand, now feel like the motions of a man going through the forms of something he no longer quite believes. He mumbles the words of absolution, ego te absolvo, filia, and they slide from his tongue like dead leaves. He reaches for his rosary and then lets it slip through his fingers, as if by design. There is a moment in the novel that captures this perfectly. Matteo is in his church, preparing for the morning Mass. He looks around at the space that was once a place of joy, where he baptized grinning infants, where a nervous bridegroom once dropped his ring and the whole congregation laughed. Now, lime buckets line the walls. The pews are swept but tense. His shoes stick in the dried remnants of vomit on the floor. The confessionals stand empty. The town no longer fears the church, the novel tells us. It simply hides in it. This is the landscape of Matteo's inner life, a landscape of absence, the absence of joy, of certainty, of the sense that his prayers are heard. He is a man standing in the ruins of his own faith, still performing the rituals, still wearing the vestments, still saying the words, but finding, in the silence that follows, nothing. And then the Brotherhood of Broken Flesh arrives. They enter Piacenza on a cold, rainy September day, and Matteo hears them before he sees them. A thick, wet percussion, the sound of leather on flesh, cutting through the hush of the rain. 30 men, stripped to the waist, their backs a living map of scars and wheals and plague sores, marching in column through the mud. They are dragging a crude cross, its oak beams blackened as if scorched by pestilential flames. At its shoulder hangs a cluster of bones, animal or human, no one can say, stitched with coarse red thread that glistens like coagulated blood. At the head of the procession walks a man, neither young nor old. His features are gaunt, carved as if for a reliquary. He wears a tunic of coarse sackcloth, sodden and streaked with mud and sweat. Around his neck, a leather cord holds a rosary, strung not with wooden beads, but with yellowed knuckle bones, child-sized relics of the plague's smallest victims. Matteo recognizes him. Before the plague, this man was known as Aureliano, from San Marco's Gate, a man Matteo remembers from a tavern brawl, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. But the man who stands before him now is something else entirely. He has been transformed by the plague, by suffering, by whatever theology he has forged in the crucible of mass death, into something that Matteo can only describe as a new kind of shepherd. Aureliano steps forward and presses his scabbed palm to the stone wellhead of the city's central square, leaving a crimson smear. "We come as fellow captives in this valley of death," he says. His voice carries the hollow hunger of a man starved for faith. "We bleed, for no other prayers ascend to heaven. This," he gestures to the dark droplets beating on the ancient stone, "is the crimson psalm our God yet hearkens to." He traces the blood with his fingertip, as though annotating sacred text. The pestilence is no scourge to flee from. It is the scripture written upon our flesh. For Matteo, This is a moment of profound and terrible recognition, because what Aureliano is offering is, in its own dark way, an answer. Not the church's answer, not the promise of salvation through ritual and obedience, but something rawer, more immediate, more viscerally real. The flagellants are not asking God to spare them. They are not offering prayers into a silence that has lasted for months. They are taking the suffering that God has visited upon them and turning it into an act of will. They are choosing to bleed, and in that choice, they find a kind of agency that the Church's theology of passive endurance can no longer provide. Aureliano's theology is brutal, but it is simple. And in a world that has been stripped of everything else, simplicity is its own kind of power. The flagellant movement was not unique to Piacenza. It had been spreading across Europe since the early days of the Black Death, moving north from Hungary and through Germany, drawing thousands of followers in its wake. The flagellants believed that the plague was God's punishment for human sin, and that the only way to appease his wrath was through an act of public, collective penance, the ritual self-flagellation that gave them their name. Their processions followed a strict ritual. They would march in columns, 2 by 2, stripped to the waist, carrying leather whips embedded with iron spikes. Twice a day, they would stop in a public square or churchyard and perform their ceremony, lying prostrate in the mud, then rising to beat themselves and each other across the back and shoulders, chanting hymns and prayers as the blood flowed. The spectacle was designed to be witnessed. It was a public act of atonement, performed on behalf of all of humanity, a sacrifice intended to turn aside God's wrath. To the plague-stricken populations of Europe, the flagellants were both terrifying and magnetic. They offered something the Church could no longer provide, the sense that something was being done, that the suffering was not meaningless, that there was a way to fight back, even if the only weapon available was your own body. The Church, for its part, was deeply ambivalent about the movement. Pope Clement VI, writing from his court in Avignon, where he had notably retreated from the plague by surrounding himself with fires to purify the air, initially tolerated the flagellants. But by October of 1349, he had issued a papal bull condemning them, alarmed by the movement's increasingly radical theology and its tendency to operate outside church authority. The flagellants, the Pope declared, were heretics. Their self-punishment was not a sacrament. It was a presumption, an arrogation of the Church's exclusive power to mediate between humanity and God. But by then, in cities like Piacenza, the Church's authority to make such pronouncements had been severely compromised. The people who flocked to watch Aureliano's procession, who pressed in around the well to hear his words, who wept and crossed themselves, and, in some cases, picked up whips of their own. These were not people who had abandoned their faith. They were people whose faith had been tested beyond endurance, and who were desperately searching for something that still worked. There is a scene in the novel that captures the full complexity of this moment with extraordinary precision. Aureliano comes to Matteo's confessional, not to confess, but to confront. He sits on the other side of the worn lattice and says quietly, "Forgive me, Father, for I have not sinned." What follows is not a confession, but a dissection. Aureliano asks Matteo how many names in his ledger he has already forgotten, how many crosses he has buried beneath memory's lime. He tells Matteo that his faith hungers, that it will not bleed, and then he asks the question that cuts to the very heart of the crisis. If God has forsaken this city, Father, why kneel at all? Matteo has no answer. He wants to invoke Rome, to cite doctrine, to retreat behind the authority of the institution. But the institution is crumbling. The authority is hollow, and Aureliano knows it. He is not offering Matteo a heresy. He is offering him a mirror. "Name the wound, Father," Aureliano says, "and perhaps the city may yet heal. But you must give it voice." Matteo's response, "I know not," is perhaps the most honest thing he has said in months, and Aureliano receives it not with triumph, but with something that sounds almost like compassion. "That is the beginning," he says. "The last absolution granted to any of us." This is the genius of Aureliano as a character and as a historical archetype. He is not simply a villain. He is a man who has looked into the abyss of the Black Death and found, in that abyss, a terrible clarity. He has abandoned the comfortable ambiguities of institutional faith and replaced them with a theology of absolute, embodied certainty. His God is not the gentle shepherd of the Psalms. His God is a God of blood and fire, a God who speaks not in whispers, but in plague and pestilence. And his answer to that God is to meet violence with violence, to answer suffering with suffering, to bleed until the heavens hear. The tragedy and the horror is that in the world of 1349 Piacenza, this makes a terrible kind of sense. The story of the Black Death is, in many ways, the story of the birth of the modern world. The catastrophe of 1348 and 1349 did not just kill people, it killed certainties. It killed the medieval worldview. The idea of a divinely ordered universe in which suffering had meaning, in which the church was God's representative on earth, in which the hierarchy of society reflected a cosmic hierarchy ordained from above. That worldview did not survive the Black Death intact. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the gradual secularization of European thought. All of these, historians have argued, have their roots in the crisis of meaning that the plague created. But that is the long view. In the short view, in the streets of Piacenza in the autumn of 1349, what the plague created was a vacuum of authority, of meaning, of the stories that hold a society together. And into that vacuum, figures like Aureliano stepped. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout history, in every culture and every era. When the institutions that provide order and meaning fail, when they are revealed to be incapable of protecting the people who depend on them, a space opens up. And that space is filled, almost inevitably, by charismatic figures who offer simple, powerful, often extreme answers to the questions that the old institutions can no longer answer. They offer certainty in the face of chaos. They offer agency in the face of helplessness. They offer a story that makes the suffering mean something. The appeal of such figures is not a sign of weakness or stupidity. It is a sign of something deeply human. The need to believe that the world makes sense, that suffering has a purpose, that there is someone, somewhere, who knows what to do. In a world where the plague has killed the priests and emptied the confessionals and left the bells tolling endlessly over the dead, the man who stands in the square and says, "I know why this is happening, and I know what to do about it," that man will always find followers. We began this episode in the rain, in the mud, in the copper-sweet stench of a city dying. We have walked through the physical reality of Piacenza in 1349, the lime buckets and the plague pits, the death carts and the empty confessionals. We have felt the collapse of the church's authority, not as an abstract historical process, but as a lived experience, the terror of dying unshriven, the grief of watching children die with no priest to comfort them, the hollow echo of prayers that no longer seem to reach anyone. We have met Father Matteo, standing at the center of this collapse, his faith eroding beneath the weight of 100 deaths, 1,000 deaths, the endless, relentless tolling of the bells. And we have met Fra Aureliano, the man who steps into the void that Matteo's failing faith has left, offering a theology of blood and certainty to a people desperate for both. The story of A Procession of Ashes is, at its heart, a story about this moment, about what happens when the old world ends and the new one has not yet begun, about the figures who emerge in that interregnum and the power they hold over those who are lost, about the seductive, dangerous clarity of a faith that has burned away everything uncertain and left only the absolute. Before we close, I want to leave you with a question. Not a rhetorical one, a real one, the kind that stays with you. The people of Piacenza in 1349 were not different from us. They were not more superstitious, or more credulous, or more easily led. They were people who had trusted the institutions of their world, the church, the civic authorities, the social bonds of family and community, and who watched those institutions fail them catastrophically in the moment of their greatest need. And in that failure, they turned to whoever offered them a story they could believe in. If the institutions you trusted collapsed tomorrow, if the systems you depend on for safety, for meaning, for the assurance that the world makes sense, if those systems failed, visibly and completely, who would you follow? Think about that, because the answer says something important, not just about the people of 1349, but about all of us. Next week, we go deeper into the world of the Brotherhood of Broken Flesh. We'll explore the theology of the flagellants in more detail, look at the historical evidence for what their rituals actually involved, and begin to follow the thread of something stranger and darker that Tommaso Bellini, the empiric physician, is beginning to trace in the bodies of the dead. Until then,